Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full.
What's up? I'm Julio Lopez, and welcome to the Workout Nerd Out. I've got my master's degree in nutrition, as well as being a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a certified personal trainer. So in my 8 years as a personal trainer, I usually get asked pretty much the same questions. The first one that I usually get asked is, what leg exercises should I be doing? Here are the 3 most important leg exercises that you should add into your workout program. Number 1, the squat. Just think about it. It is the foundational leg exercise. You do squats more often than you think. If you pick up your kids, if you move your furniture, sitting down and getting back up, guess what? You're squatting, and you don't even have to have a gym membership to have to squat. So it's highly effective in working the large leg muscles, and it incorporates the core and knee stability. It encourages hip and ankle mobility that can help carry on through your senior years. So it's not something that is only going to benefit you in your younger years. Even as you get older, being able to squat is going to help you be more mobile as you get older. Other variations of the squat include the front squat. This is a good one. I really like it just because it's really good at reducing the amount of stress that happens in the lower back, because you're keeping a more upright posture, since the weight, instead of being in the back like you would with a regular back squat, it's now in the front. If you've got a clean grip or a cross arm grip, the weight is resting in front, so you're able to maintain a taller posture. Again, if you're someone that suffers from low back pain, this is a really good option. And it's using less weight than a back squat. The advantage to this is that it's putting less wear and tear on your body. I know a lot of you might be thinking, what? Wait a minute, you're saying less weight is better, but isn't it better to be able to add more weight? That's where research comes in. The research shows that the amount of hypertrophy going on, this is hypertrophy as muscle size growth, that goes on when doing a back squat compared to a front squat, are really quite similar, even though you're carrying much less weight with the front squat versus the back squat. And of course, that means less wear and tear on your body, meaning you can do it longer without risking injury. There's also the split squat. This is what Coach Mike Boyle, one of the most renowned strength and conditioning coaches, preaches all the time, and he gets a little controversial about that. He believes in doing split squats instead of back squats more often, because his athletes include offensive and defensive linemen, and when you're an NFL lineman, there's a good chance those guys can squat 600 pounds and up. But they're also getting paid millions of dollars. So if they're trying to rack up as much weight on the barbell just to show off, just for their training, they are running the risk of injuring themselves. And if they injure themselves, there goes their playing time. If they're not getting any playing time, there's really no reason for the NFL owners to want to pay them the millions of dollars. So those athletes have to be sure that they're taking care of their body while still strengthening their body. So the thing about the split squat is just one leg forward, the other leg back, and you're bending down. The thing about it is that, yes, you're carrying much less weight. Obviously, it's not an exact science like you would with getting your back squat weight and dividing it by 2 and say, all right, that should be my split squat weight. It's not really that easy. Instead, you're probably going to have to do some discovery training where you're trying to find out what is a good rep range that you want to go for. Because it's using less weight, this means less wear and tear on your muscle and your back. It also helps improve balance. Since you're in a staggered stance, instead of having the feet beside each other like you would with a regular back squat or a front squat, now there's the difference of having to balance yourself from side to side movement a lot more than you would with the regular squat. There's also the sumo squat. I really like this one. And the last time that I injured my back, I had to find other different variations of the squats. The back squat and the front squat were actually causing more torque to my lower back than I wanted, so I want to make sure that I could still get a good squatting exercise that wouldn't put a lot of pressure on my lower back. So this was why I did a lot of sumo squats. It's effective in training the glutes and the hip adductors. So by hip adductors, I mean the groin muscles. It's And because it's training those groin muscles, it's good for preventing groin injuries. If you're somebody that plays pickup games of soccer, basketball, hockey, you're going to want to do those exercises that train those groin muscles, because those are some of the most commonly injured muscles that recreational and professional and amateur athletes are suffering quite often. And then there's the lunge, similar to the split squat, but it adds movement, either a forward lunge where you're lunging forward or a reverse lunge where you're lunging backwards. The movement going forward or backwards, whichever variation you're using, it adds momentum. So your muscles have to work overtime compared to the split squat, because you've got the force of gravity and the momentum and inertia that your muscles have to effectively slow down on the way down in your descent phase, in the eccentric phase of your lift. So you actually do gain more strength by doing so. I don't know if you've ever heard of eccentric training. That's basically you're overloading the amount of weight that you usually do and really focusing on going down super slowly, and that has been shown to be very beneficial for gaining strength. With the lunge, you're not really adding more weight than you would with the split squat. You could use a similar amount of weight as the two, but because there's the added movement that increases the amount of eccentric load, you're actually going to get a better workout. And because the eccentric load is greater and your muscles are going to be fatiguing more than the split squat, you're probably going to have to perform fewer repetitions than you would with a regular split squat. And that's just because your muscles are going to have to work a lot harder and they're going to get tired. Number 2 of the most important leg exercises you should be doing is the deadlift. The hamstrings are among the most commonly injured muscles by recreational weightlifting and sports participants. So if you're somebody that likes to take part in company softball games, or you like to go work out at the gym, you really have to be careful about those hamstrings. So if you ask a sports injury doctor or a physical therapist, they'll probably tell you that the hamstrings are among the most commonly injured for recreational athletes, just because they often don't get trained as much, because you don't really see hamstrings too often. You see the quads in the mirror when you're looking at yourself, but very few guys especially look at the back. Girls usually see the back of their muscles because they're trying to get a good selfie, but that doesn't mean that guys do that as well. So they're not going to be training the hamstrings as often that they do with the quads. The deadlift is also well regarded by strength and conditioning experts as among the most beneficial exercises for the posterior chain muscles, particularly, of course, the hamstrings. Also, it requires the entire lower body musculature and contributions from upper body strength. Remember, you're carrying a lot of weight, which does engage the lats, the core, the arms, the forearms especially, when you're carrying that weight. And you're supposed to keep holding onto that weight. So that's going to lead to upper body muscular strength gains as well as the lower body strength. Obviously, you're not going to get super buff in the upper body just by holding a barbell, but there's still some benefits to it, especially when it comes to grip strength. My 2 favorite deadlift variations are the Romanian deadlifts, or RDL for short, since this puts most of the focus on the hamstrings. And actually, most strength and conditioning coaches actually prefer this variation of the deadlift the most, because there's a lower risk of injury. Since with a conventional deadlift, you're lifting it from the ground, there is a higher risk of a lower back injury, especially with an athlete who's more often than not someone that's very strong, so they can pack on a lot more weight on their barbell. And since athletes are very competitive, they're going to want to push themselves. The last thing any coach wants from their athlete is injuring themselves during training, so that's why very often they go with the RDL more than a conventional deadlift. Doesn't mean that the conventional deadlift is useless. It's definitely very useful, but RDL is a safer option, and it targets the hamstrings more accurately, more specifically than it does with a conventional deadlift. My second favorite of the deadlift variations is a trap bar deadlift, also known as a hex bar deadlift. The reason for the 2 is kind of obvious. If you look at the hex bar or trap bar, or whatever you want to call it, is 1, shaped like a hexagon. There's 6 sides to it. And 2, you're inside that hexagon, so you're pretty much trapped, and that's why it's called that. I really like this because just like with the front squat, you're maintaining a taller posture. So when you're not leaning forward quite as much, that means less torque gets put on the lower back. So again, if you're somebody that has a history of lower back injuries, this is a very good option for you to still be able to do a good quality deadlift exercise without really risking yourself in suffering a lower back injury. It obviously depends on the severity of your lower back injury. If you're somebody that's further down the line that has like really badly herniated discs, then definitely go check with a physical therapist before you do any of these. Other variations that are very good include the good morning. So this one is basically an RDL, but you're holding the barbell on your shoulders just like you would with a squat. Feet are a little more narrow like you do with a regular deadlift, and you're simply doing the same motion as the regular RDL where you're letting those hips slide back, keeping the core super duper tight, letting the torso come down as the hips slide back so you'll feel a nice deep stretch. Make sure that you maintain the same amount of knee bend as you normally do when you're standing. Don't lock out the knees. Instead, allow a little bit of a bend, letting those hips slide back. With the weight being higher up, this increases the amount of stretch that you'll get in the hamstrings. So you'll be carrying less weight than you would with the RDL when you're doing a good morning. And you have to be really, really careful about not allowing that back to be bending as you're doing the exercise. You don't want to be hunched over and straightened out, or you don't want to be straightened and when you're going down, hunch over just because you want the chest to go down lower. You want to make sure that that back doesn't bend any more than it did from the beginning to the end of every repetition. Keep it the same. That will help keep your lower back safe. Another good thing about the good morning is that you don't always have to do it with the barbell. You can also do it with the super bend. Simply have the super bend underneath your feet, up over your head. Make sure that you're resting it on your traps instead of on your neck. You can still do it if it's on the neck, but it'll be really, really uncomfortable. That's why I tell everybody to sit down when they're doing it. Get the band up over their heads. Make sure it's placed on the traps. If needed, have somebody else help you so you could get it right. Because I'm telling you, if you have it on your neck, it's really uncomfortable. Also, there's the single leg deadlift. So this one, you're actually allowing one foot to raise as you're leaning forward. So think of it like the golfer's lift, basically. This is really good, just like the split squat, in evening out the strength between each leg. But balance is definitely a big issue for many people when they try this. So it's going to take a lot of practice for most folks to really get the hang of it. If you're really struggling with the balance, a good alternative to this is the B-stance deadlift. So B-stance basically means that you're in a slightly stagger stance. The back foot isn't quite as far back as it is with the regular split squat or with the lunge. It's really just a few inches. The toe is just a few inches, maybe like 6 inches behind the heel of the front foot. And the movement is basically the same as the regular RDL, where you're really just focusing on those hips sliding back as the chest comes down. Allow the back leg to bend as much, keeping all the weight on the front leg. So that way you could feel all the stretch going on in the front leg and focusing on making that leg doing all the work. Try not to make the back leg help out at all. Just think of the back leg as just like a kickstand. In addition to that, with a single leg deadlift or the B-stance deadlift, if the glutes are something that you're trying to work on as well, doing a contralateral variation is very beneficial to you. What I mean by contralateral is basically you might be only holding one dumbbell on the side opposite to the planted foot. What that does, it adds more stretch and requires the gluteus medius. That's the outside part of the glute, the side part of the glute that is going to be working to be able to maintain that knee stability. Make sure that you don't allow that knee to be caving in as you're doing the exercise. Focusing on making sure that the knee stays aligned with the outside eyelets of your shoes. So you want to make sure with either the B-stance deadlift or the single leg deadlift that you're forming a number 7. So with the leg is angled a bit and the hips are parallel with the ground. This means that you're forming a number 7. For one leg, it'll look like a backwards number 7. The other leg, it'll look like a regular number 7. Maintaining that number 7 throughout the repetition, making sure that the foot is directly aligned with your navel. Finally, what is the third most important lower body exercise that you should be doing? The hip thrust. This is personally my absolute favorite exercise for many reasons. One time I injured my back pretty badly, so I had to look for different types of exercises that could benefit that would help me rehab my lower back injury. And that's where I found the hip thrust. I used to think of the hip thrust as nothing more than just a little booty building exercise that a bunch of girls did. The only problem was basically everyone that I did see doing hip thrusts, they really only did body weight, or they were just using like a 5-pound plate. So I wasn't really too convinced that that was going to be eventually be able to get me to strengthen my lower back when I'm trying to heal it. Of course, when I started, basically the first month of my training with the hip thrust was strictly body weight, and then slowly but surely I moved up to dumbbells and then used the barbell. I got to my PR, which is 605 pounds. So as you can see, it's really easy for someone to be able to gain strength when they're doing a hip thrust. This is one of the biggest benefits that I like about the hip thrust. So what is it that I like about the hip thrust? It's safe and easy to learn. So yeah, basically you're leaning on a bench with the feet firmly planted and you're lifting up the hips. It's not as many movements going on all at the same time as you do with like a deadlift or with the squat, where you've got multiple joints bending at the same time. With the hip thrust, you're really just going up and back down. But with every other type of lift that I mentioned earlier, there is always the risk potential of injuring your back, so you got to make sure that you're using proper technique. With most individuals, you can start keeping a thoracic bend, so if you're leaning on the bench looking straight forward, the upper part of your back remains kind of curved, whereas the lower part of your back stays flat, and you're maintaining that throughout the repetition. There are some people that do suffer from neck injuries, so that might not be very possible because all it does is aggravate their neck injury. In that case, keeping a neutral spine is totally fine. But you got to make sure that you're maintaining what's called a posterior pelvic tilt. By posterior pelvic tilt, I basically mean, think of like a puppy when it's scared, how it tucks in its tail. So pretty much like you see a lot of Instagram girls sticking out their butt, arching their back. It's the complete opposite, where you're tucking your butt in, keeping that back nice and flat. That's going to help protect the lower back from getting injured. It's a loaded hip extension exercise, which makes it the most effective way for you to train the glutes. So if you're wondering how does that train the glutes, look at chimps. They have no booty, but they can stand upright for a little while, but ultimately they go back to being on all fours. Same thing goes with gorillas. Big old muscular gorillas, zero booty, so that's why they're walking on all fours most of the time. Humans, we got big old booties compared to the chimps, and you're walking all the time upright. You don't really see a whole lot of people walking on all fours because we've got glute muscles that are able to sustain the hip extension for a really, really long time. It's really great for reducing back pain because you don't always have to use heavier lifts. Like I mentioned earlier where I said my PR was 605 pounds, it doesn't mean that you have to lift 605 pounds. Anyhow, that's not really that impressive. I've seen some girls that can do over 700 pounds and some guys doing 800 pounds and up. But if you're barely getting into it, how I started, remember, I just did bodyweight for the first couple of weeks. And since it is a really great way for you to strengthen up the glutes, it's good for increasing confidence in the gym. Especially girls love this because they're able to hip thrust a lot more than a lot of guys can deadlift or squat. So they could smirk at the guys and be like, that's all you're lifting? So if you want to show up some gym bros, hip thrust is the way to go. There's a number of hip thrust variations that I like as well. There's a glute bridge. This is basically the hip thrust that's performed on the floor. So basically you're in sit-up position. You can have a barbell over your waist just like you do with a regular hip thrust, and it involves a shorter range of motion, which allows you to engage the glutes a lot more because you're able to do heavier weight. When read with an EMG, you can actually see more glute activity going on when performing a glute bridge. The only caveat with the glute bridge that I'm really not a fan of is that, especially when you're doing heavier lifts, you do tend to slide. There are ways around it. If you do have those foam plyo boxes, you can have your head going in between the plyo boxes with the plyo boxes up against the wall, and that'll prevent you from sliding. Or if it's not too awkward, you could have somebody standing over you where you're resting your shoulders up against their ankles, and that'll prevent you from sliding. But that might be a little weird because you'll be able to look up their shorts. I don't know if you really want to do that, but that is another option. I've seen Brett Contreras also mention using a Bosu ball for keeping you stable, but I tried it myself. I wasn't a really big fan of it. When it comes to just body weight or lower weight stuff, I'm a big fan of the glute bridge, and it's also really beneficial when barely learning how to do the hip thrust. There's also the frog thrust or frog pump. The frog thrust is basically the hip thrust with your feet together and the knees are flared out 45 degrees. The frog pump is pretty much the glute bridge which is the hip thrust done on the floor. Same thing, the feet are together, the knees are flared out 45 degrees. Some people feel a much deeper burn when doing a frog thrust or frog pump. Others don't. I happen to be on the side where I don't really feel a big benefit with these, but I do have a lot of clients that have told me that they feel a really deep burn when they're doing the frog thrusts or frog pumps. So give it a try if you want to see what it's like. If you feel it or if you don't feel it, know that you're not alone. There's a hip thrust when using a band. So in the hip thrust variation when using a loop band, you have the band around the legs. So I always tell my clients that they could either have the band either above or below the knees. Make sure that it's not all the way up where you're really not stretching out the band, because otherwise you're not getting any benefit out of the band. If the band is too short, you are going to have the band go up a little higher to actually be able to move out the legs, because I know some bands are really short, and if you got them up around the knee area, you'll barely be able to stretch it out over 6 inches, having the knees over 6 inches apart, which might not be really beneficial when you're doing a hip thrust. So if that's the case, I'd probably buy a different band or use a different band. An added benefit to using a band when you're doing a hip thrust is that it creates isometric stress in the gluteus medius. So what that means is, your gluteus medius, again, that's the outside part of your glute muscle that helps in creating knee stability. And it's working continuously as your glute maximus and also the glute minimus are working dynamically. So while the glute max is getting a rest when you're at the bottom of a hip thrust and having to work over time when the hips are going up to the top, if you're keeping your knees out wide throughout, your gluteus medius muscle is having to work constantly. Now, the caveat to using a loop band when you're doing a hip thrust is that you're not going to be able to use as much weight. If you're looking for your PR, definitely it should be a no-brainer that you wouldn't be using a loop band when you're doing a hip thrust, unless you're trying to find your PR of your hip thrust while using a loop band. There's also the deficit hip thrust. I love these because you definitely feel a really good burn, especially when you're using a loop band. So what this means is it's a hip thrust, you're leaning on a bench, you've got your feet up on a bench. Make sure that it's your heel or the middle part of your foot that's on the edge of the bench, and you've got the two benches far enough apart from each other where you're able to get a full range of motion. So because your feet are elevated and so are your shoulders, you're able to drop the hips a lot lower than you would with a conventional hip thrust. Therefore, meaning there's more time under tension. Your glutes are having to work longer throughout each repetition. And then when you're adding a loop band, since you got that isometric stress in the gluteus medius, it doesn't take a whole lot of repetitions for you to start feeling a really, really deep burn. I mean, for me and most of my clients, After the 10 or 15 repetitions, that's where you're really starting to feel it a lot more than you did the first couple of repetitions. And this, I'm talking about just body weight hip thrusts. So I don't care how badass you think you are, try doing 20 or 25 repetitions with a deficit hip thrust using a loop band. If you could do those 25 repetitions without feeling a good deep burn or without struggling, then you're a lot tougher than I am. So that does it. Those are the 3 most important leg exercises that I think you should add into your workout program. If you got any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help.